Hello, everybody. Hi, if I can get everyone's attention. All right, welcome, everybody. Welcome to Green College. My name is Andrew Alexander. I'm your academic host for this evening. I'm a second-year master's student in the Department of Mathematics and also a second-year resident here at Green College. So, as always, I'd like to begin our evening with an acknowledgement that Green College and UBC are situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. This is a place of living and learning as we know it now, but it has been so for the Musqueam long before any of us were here. Okay, we are very excited this evening to hear from Dr. Guobin Yang, who's here at UBC as a Cecil H. and Ida Green visiting professor. This program began all the way back in 1972 as an opportunity for UBC students and faculty, as well as interested members of the public, to interact with outstanding scholars, artists, and intellectuals from outside of British Columbia. Now, for a more formal introduction before I take too much of the limelight, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dr. Renren Yang, who is an assistant professor of Asian Studies here at UBC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for your generous introduction. And good afternoon to everyone who are with us today in the room, and also good afternoon to the audience online. I'm Renren Yang, and I teach modern Chinese literature, film, and popular culture in the Department of Asian Studies at UBC, and it is my pleasure to welcome every one of you to today's event. I also want to mention that this event, and also Professor Guobin Yang's visit, is co-sponsored by Center for Chinese Research, Department of Asian Studies, and Green College at UBC. And also many thanks to our colleagues Sarah and Heather and Andrew for their and other student assistants in CCR and Asian Studies whose behind-the-scene work had made today's event a reality. Before I introduce Professor Guobin Yang, I also like to remind you that there will be an opportunity for Q&A after his talk, and hope all of you will join us for the reception afterwards. And also, please note that today's lecture is being live-streamed and recorded. Professor Guobin Yang is a Grace Lee Boggs Professor of Communication and Sociology at the Annenberg School for Communication and Department of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is Director of the Center on Digital Culture and Society and Deputy Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China. He has authored 3 monographs: the Wuhan Lockdown, 2022, the Red Guard Generation and Political Activism in China, 2016, and the Power of the Internet in China, Citizen Activism Online, 2009. So I have brought copies of these works today, and please feel free to take a look at them as they circulate through the room to learn more about his contributions, scholarly contributions. And I think the books are here. His current work focuses on social media, narrative, and emotions in everyday activism, digital culture, and pandemic storytelling. In addition to the monographs, Professor Yang has edited or co-edited 7 books, including Pandemic Crossing, Engaging Social Media in China. I'm just reading the main titles of those books. Media Activism in the Digital Age, The Internet, Social Media, and the Changing China, China's Contested Internet, Re-envisioning the Chinese Revolution. He also authored over 40 refereed single-author journal articles and 39 referred book chapters. For students and scholars in literary studies, I also want to mention that Professor Yang is the translator of an annotated English translation of 6th century classic of Chinese literary theory, Wenxing Diaolong, Dragon Carving and the Literary Mind. Professor Yang is also an elected fellow of the International Communication Association, and he serves on the editorial boards of numerous journals, such as Sociological Forum, Social Media and Society, Chinese Journal of Sociology, China Information. He also serves on the advisory boards of Emotions and Society and Asianscape, Digital Asia. Before he joined UPenn, he taught as an assistant professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and at Barnard College of Columbia University. He was a fellow at Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. from 2003 to 2004. And for me personally, one of the most impressive things about Professor Guobin Yang's scholarship is its remarkable breadth and interdisciplinary nature, situated at the intersection of sociology, communication, history, media, and literary studies. Students across social science and the humanities all benefit from Professor Yang's insightful work. And today, Professor Yang will share his recent thoughts on narrative storytelling and social media in contemporary China, and his talk is entitled, "Is There a Crisis of Narration? Narrative Imagination on Chinese Social Media?" So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Guobin Yang.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you to Professor Renren Yang for such a wonderful introduction. I'm really embarrassed by all the great things you said. Not sure I can live up to that. I also want to thank the Green College and our Center for Chinese Studies and Professor Yang and other colleagues for inviting me to the Green College. And this is really a wonderful opportunity. I appreciate everything that has been done to make this happen. And I really appreciate the environment outside. It's such a beautiful place, and the weather is gorgeous, just so wonderful. I want to start by also honoring, since I'm talking about storytelling, I want to honor the masculine tradition of weaving, which, like storytelling, is the fabric of their land and the people. I want to tell the story, for starters, that is both familiar and not so familiar, in order to make an argument about narrative imagination on Chinese social media. The story is well known because ever since it started on Chinese social media in 2020, it has been told and retold and continues to be told today. It has also been covered by major media, global media networks. But how the story has been told, how the story was originally told on Chinese social media, and how it continues to be told is not as well known. And that's what I would like to talk about today. The protagonist of the story, some of you may have guessed, is Dr. Li Wenliang from the city of Wuhan. Often known as the whistleblower of COVID-19, Dr. Li died of COVID on February the 7th, 2020. His death was followed by an outpouring of grieving on Chinese social media, which was also an outpouring of storytelling. In the 30-year history of the internet in China, Chinese internet users had mourned the death of many other individuals. But I had never seen something at such a massive scale and emotional intensity. It reminded me of only two other occasions which were pre-internet. The outpouring of poetry on April the 5th, 1976, mourning the death of Premier Zhou Enlai on Tiananmen Square. And the outpouring of wall posters, including poetry, on university campuses in Beijing after the death of reform leader Hu Yaobang on April the 15th, 1989. Although those were also extraordinary moments of narrative imagination, I won't have time, unfortunately, to talk about them, and I'll focus only on the narrative imagination storytelling on Chinese social media. I'll start by reading three short excerpts from one story, one of numerous stories that circulated and have been circulating on Chinese social media since 2020. The title of the story is Records of the Grand Historian, the Biography of Li Wenliang. This is the title. The beginning, this is the screenshot from the original WeChat public account where I saved it. So this is a biography of Dr. Li Wenliang, written in the form of Records of the Grand Historian, and I'll come back to this later on. But I want to start by reading 3 short excerpts from this biography. So, excerpt 1, which is the beginning of the biography. Li Wenliang, and this is a translation which I did using ChatGPT, but with my editing, of course, because it didn't get everything correctly. But it was helpful. Li Wenliang, whose polite name, sometimes also translated as courtesy name, Zi, was served the public, was born in 1985 in Jinzhou Prefecture, Fengtian Province. He was quick-witted from a young age, and with a little guidance from his teachers, he could recite texts effortlessly. One evening, Li Wenliang's father noticed him engrossed in his studies and approached to see what he was reading. He asked, "Do you aspire to be a scholar? Otherwise, why read the books of the great writer Lu Xun?" Li Wenliang shook his head and replied, "I aspire to be a physician." His father was puzzled and asked again, "Haven't you heard the words of Lu Xun? Even if you study medicine, you cannot save the people of the world." Li Wenliang responded, "Although studying medicine cannot save the world, it can still treat illnesses. But if one becomes a writer, there is no steady income throughout the year, and there are risks of being invited to tea every day. Isn't that miserable? Therefore, even though," I'll come back to explain some of the references, allusions. This is part of the narrative imagination, I suppose. "Therefore, even though the position of a physician may be lowly, there will always be a way to serve the country. Why shouldn't I strive for it?" His father nodded in agreement, praising him endlessly. So then the biography goes on to tell in quite detail, really good detail, how Dr. Li went on to college and studied medicine. So I skip a few paragraphs, and this is the second excerpt I'm going to read from the biography. Quote, "After 7 years, Li Wenliang became a physician and worked in the city of Xiamen. Then, after 3 years, he returned to Jiangcheng, which is another name for Wuhan, and joined the Central Hospital. That's where he worked when he died, specializing in ophthalmology. His patients rarely failed to recover. People were curious and asked him, 'I heard that you once lamented about the SARS epidemic, regretting not being able to do more. Now that you specialize in eye diseases, doesn't this go against your initial intentions?' Li Wenliang smiled and replied, 'There are 2 kinds of blindness. One is an eye disease, which can be treated with medicine. The other is the blindness of the heart, which cannot be cured, no matter how hard you try. There are many in the world who are blind to truth, unable or unwilling to speak the facts. This is the blindness that cannot be cured.'" That's the second excerpt. And then the biography continues, goes on to detail how Dr. Li Wenliang was detained because of his social media post about COVID, and that's why he was called the whistleblower, and then how he finally died of COVID. And then here's the conclusion of the biography. This is the quote the grand historian comments. So this, in the records of the grand historian, the biographies almost always end with this comment. The grand historian comments. Li Wenliang, who had always risked his life for others, spoke out in a group to warn the public, only to be reprehended by the authorities and falsely labeled as a rumor monger. Isn't that tragic? We lived through peaceful years, believing that nothing could go wrong. But when pneumonia struck suddenly, we couldn't believe it. We dismissed the words of a physician as rumors, and once disaster befell us, we ran to hospitals to see doctors, clinging to our lives. Why didn't we act sooner? Li Wenliang truly lived up to the name of a physician who treats eye diseases. Though he died, how many people's eyes were opened to the truth because of him? End quotes. And that's the end of the biography. That was only one of about 30 different versions of Dr. Li's biographies that I collected. It was written, and most of these, almost all of them, were written in the ancient form of 列传, in the 史记, in the records of grand historian, which is sometimes translated as arrayed biography. Arrayed meaning in orderly fashion, which also means just putting the life and deeds of a person in good order so that they may be passed on to future generations. Arrayed biographies make up the largest section in the most famous historical work in Chinese civilization, the 史记, again, the records of the grand historian, written by Sima Qian, who lived from about year 145 BCE to year 86 BCE. I think I have some, I didn't get to show these slides, forgot these, but these are just some of the, the excerpts I cited. This is interesting. Completely in line with the original form of 史记. All these biographies even had footnotes for their own texts. The importance of form is what what I'm going to talk about. And this is Burton Watson's translation of the records of the grand historian, and this is the Chinese volumes. Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang also translated and had an anthology of translation of this great masterpiece of Chinese history. So these 列传 or biographies, they are biographies of famous historical figures such as generals, ministers, and scholars. They are also masterpieces of classical prose, of superior literary merit, and therefore they are often excerpted in school textbooks and are well known and revered by the educated public. Using the classical 史记 style biography to write about Dr. Li Wenliang, instead of using today's plain Mandarin 普通话, right, is a rhetorical device to elevate Dr. Li to the stature of the historical figures in the famous 史记. Part of this biography, even the episodes I read, I shared, part of it was fictional. For example, Li Wenliang didn't have a polite name, didn't have 字, right? As people usually did in ancient times. That was really something of the past. But the author of Dr. Li's biography almost always gave him a polite name anyway, just in line with the style, with the form in 史记. Is because that's what Sima Qian did in his great work. But also serve the public as a polite name or courtesy name is also appropriate, very appropriate, because of Dr. Li's role as a physician and a whistleblower in the COVID-19. The dialogue between Dr. Li and his father would have to be fictional as well. Again, it makes good sense, and would be both familiar and fitting to Chinese readers because it alludes to a popular story about China's most famous modern writer, Lu Xun. In the early 20th century, Lu Xun gave up medicine to take up writing because he believed that writing would save more people by opening up their minds. By saying that Dr. Li chose to practice medicine rather than becoming a scholar, the author of the biography was comparing Dr. Li to Lu Xun, with the only difference, major difference though, that Dr. Li made a different choice than Lu Xun. The anecdote, as some of you again noticed, also made a jab at government control by saying that the reason why Dr. Li chose to be a physician instead of a writer was to avoid the risks of being invited to tea. On Chinese social media, being invited to tea is a familiar code name for saying being questioned by the police. The third paragraph was an allusion to another detail in Dr. Li's life. On January 31st, 2020, he took an interview when he was already sick. He took an interview with a major commercial newspaper in China. When a journalist asked him whether he would seek rehabilitation from the police station which had wrongly accused him of spreading rumors, Dr. Li said no. And quote, this is quote, Dr. Li's words. It's more important than that people now know the truth. Repairing my reputation is not that important anymore. A healthy society should not have only one voice. Since then, Dr. Li's words, a healthy society should not have only one voice, have become a popular meme on Chinese social media. So like I said, this is only one of many versions of Dr. Li's biography in circulation in 2020. Not all of them are still there. Some of them are still available on social media. Most, I think, disappeared. And the majority of these biographies used the established form from the records of the grand historian. So, question here is, why did an ancient narrative form become so popular? So I will mention a few reasons, emphasizing the formal features of the biography genre. First one is that it used classical Chinese language, which adds rhetorical and literary elegance to the story, but also an ambivalent tone of both seriousness and a bit of humor, playfulness, the creative use of the Chinese language. Linguistic ambivalence is a rhetorical strategy in navigating platform censorship. It is as if the author was saying, I'm writing this as a creative exercise, not as a means of political protest. But in reality, the text is open to multiple interpretations. As the point of ambivalence. It makes more explicitly political statements than is possible in plain 普通话 Mandarin Chinese. There's much more politics in these classical Chinese biographies than you can say in plain Chinese. Another feature of the biography form in the 史记 is, as I mentioned earlier on, that every biography ends with a paragraph which is called 太史公约, the grand historian comments or the grand historian remarks. The grand historian summarizes different translations. This was Sima Qian's narrative device to offer moral judgment on the biography subject. Authors of Dr. Li's biographies all made use of this feature to comment on the integrity of his character and the sacrifices he made for public good. The third feature, which I really want to emphasize, third feature of the ancient Chinese biography genre is the use of the anecdote. So according to Chinese historian David Schaberg, in this book, A Patterned Path, Form and Thought in Early Chinese Historiography, the basic unit of narrative in classical Chinese historical writing is the anecdote. The anecdotes are also used in Western historiography, but in Chinese classical historiography, this is the most important, most dominant mode of narrative. The anecdote typically captures critical moments or important deeds of an individual's life in vivid language and dramatic detail. While portraying character, the anecdote was also used to make moral judgments about historical events and characters. Therefore, any narrative detail in ancient history has the potential of rising to the general significance as long as it reveals moral meaning. The authors of Dr. Li's biographies also follow the Shiji model and fill their biographies of Dr. Li Wenliang with anecdotes of his life. And the three excerpts I shared really are three anecdotes from his life. Anecdotes are effective narrative devices because they are short and vivid. They present memorable scenes to illuminate the character's life. They contain strong moral sentiments and emotions. They are also reader-friendly because they are easy to remember and retell. At the same time, the anecdotes put demands on readers. Readers who are listening or reading these stories need to know the context and cultural allusions to understand the full significance, especially the moral significance, the political meanings, often the implicit political meanings of these anecdotes. This means that when storytellers mobilize their imagination in telling stories, they also depend on the narrative imagination of their readers to make sense of their stories. Another narrative form, which I will mention very briefly, which also makes use of anecdotes, was the lockdown diary, which was actually a much more influential form during the lockdown. The lockdown diary was the most important narrative form on social media during the Wuhan lockdown. Many Wuhan residents wrote diaries to record their lockdown experiences. And on the day of Dr. Li's death, all the diaries I read mourned his death. All, without exception, every diarist who had an entry that day wrote about his death. But then no diary can be a complete recording of the diarist's daily experiences. It's usually a collection of selected episodes in our lives, right? Think about if we write diaries, it's impossible to write a complete list, complete documentation of all the activities in a day. It's always a selection of episodes, different kinds of episodes. So just to give one example about this vivid episodes in diaries, and then I'll go on. I'll just give one example. It's about an incident that the diarist recorded on the first anniversary of Dr. Li's death. The diarist was taking a taxi in Wuhan. The taxi was crossing the tunnel under the Yangtze River. And in the middle of the crossing, the taxi driver suddenly uttered a sigh. Tomorrow is Dr. Li Wenliang's anniversary. The taxi driver just randomly sighed and said this to his passenger, who took notice and then recorded it in his diary for that day and reported this incident, this anecdote, in his entry for that day. I think it's a very vivid anecdote that shows that Dr. Li continued to live in people's memory, that his stories continue to be told and retold. So now let me come back to the narrative features of the biography form and discuss a little bit how they work with the functions of social media. Media scholars sometimes use the language of affordances of social media. I think we can just also use, say, functions of social media. So we've all read about censorship on Chinese social media, but censorship, and we all know, has not stopped users from being active or creative. There are many examples of narrative imagination. Broadly on social media, I'll just to mention, for instance, internet fiction in China, unlike here, is a huge industry. Half of China's internet population, it's over 1 billion, the internet population. Half of the internet population, according to recent survey numbers, read internet fiction. So that's certainly an excellent example of narrative imagination. Actually, Professor Renren Yang just published a special issue on web novels, right? It's also would fall under what I think of examples of narrative imagination. But I won't go into narrative internet fiction, and we'll only focus on stories like the ones I shared about Dr. Li, which appeared in everyday interactions on social media, which are also full of imagination. These everyday expressions have a lot to do with the functional features of social media. Social media nowadays often call themselves platforms. Again, we are familiar with this language of platforms, but they used to be called or known as bulletin board systems, BBS, or websites, or blogs, or microblogs, or portal sites, not platforms. But platforms sound much better because they give the impression that they are open, free, and neutral. They are just set up for people to connect and have fun, and all for free. But we all know also that that's not quite true, right? That social media corporations make money out of our private data. That's why they all encourage users like us to share your life, share your happiness, share your personal information. But users are not all, that dumb, right? They turn social media platforms into their own platforms, into their own personal platforms, to the extent that we might argue that along with the platformization of society that has been much talked about in media circles, a process of personal platformization also seems to be happening at the same time. On December 30th, 2019, Dr. Li posted the following message to his WeChat moment, for which he was detained by the police. Quote, "The most recent news is that the coronavirus has been confirmed. Please do not communicate this information beyond the group. Let your families and kinsfolk take precautions." He was active on WeChat. He was also active on Weibo, another major social media platform that probably many of us use, where for years on Weibo, he had posted updates about his daily life. I have a few slides from. This is the last Weibo post that he made. That's on January 31st, 2021, which says that now it's confirmed I'm diagnosed with COVID. And if you see in smaller fonts at the bottom, it's 1 million plus, several million plus comments, because every day, if you go there and refresh the monitor, you see new comments all the time. People continue to leave comments. And then there are other postings from his earlier, from earlier times. This was about 10 days ago when I checked. I just randomly screenshot this new comments that were posted under Dr. Li's posting. on March the 8th. But there will be many, many new ones if you check now. This was posted on November 9th, 2019. Nice sceneries, and he said, so beautiful, when I have time, I'm going to bring little Li to experience it, referring to his son. This is another, I'm referring to another feature of, or another affordance of social media, which is interaction or interactivity. Users interact with the authors of Dr. Li's biographies and among themselves, liking, sharing, making comments on WeChat. A lot of these biographies on WeChat, we all know, have you can leave comments. There are a lot of interactions between author and reader, but also among readers. So reader comments function as paratexts of the main narrative line. They help sometimes further develop the narrative plot by adding personal insights, by adding their own vivid anecdotes, personal stories from their own experiences, by confirming, oh, this is well said, exactly how I felt, things like endless comments of that kind. So, like I mentioned, after Dr. Li died, people continued to visit his Weibo account and leave comments there. And they often address him directly. So I have a few examples of the translations of the screenshots I just showed, and several from other screenshots I took. For instance, on March the 8th, somebody posted, "Good morning," quote, "Good morning, Dr. Li. Just wanted to say hi to you. COVID is over. We are all okay." So this is one. Another one. "Good morning, Dr. Li. Today I'd like to ask you to watch over my little baby." Another comment. "I can't find a job. My rent will be due soon. I don't know what kind of life to live." All kinds of comments like this are shared. So people not only continue to tell stories about Dr. Li through this kind of comments and interactions, but Dr. Li's Weibo has become a public platform for telling their own stories. Continuing to be actively engaging with Dr. Li's Weibo is also an important means of keeping his account active and alive. In fact, at one point, Dr. Li's Weibo posts all disappeared, together with the millions of user comments. But then they miraculously reappeared after people voiced protests. Li Wenliang's Weibo account may still be removed by the platform's management team. But if it has remained active for the past 5 years, it is because readers have never stopped posting comments there. So there are, I only mentioned diary and biography, but there are many other kinds of storytelling genres, photography, poetry, short stories. There are short stories written about Dr. Li Wenliang, photography, calligraphy, and so on. All these together, and it's countless. Really, I have collected so much material. Just shows there's such an outpouring of storytelling after Dr. Li's death. So why? We want to understand how to understand this kind of outpouring of stories under conditions of political constraint, because the platforms are censored, censorship was tightened during the pandemic. According to the Confucian classic, the Analects, grieving, complaining, protesting were one of the 4 functions of poetry. So this is a quote from the Analects. Poetry can be used to stimulate, to observe, to socialize, and to grieve. There are various translations of this, but just want to emphasize the last word, to grieve, which also means protest and complaining. One possible reason, therefore, following this tradition, is that the outpouring of stories about Dr. Li is because tragedies make people sad and angry and sorrowful feelings fired imagination to tell stories. Happy things don't necessarily stir imagination, at least not in the same way. According to the late Professor Qian Zhongshu, in his article, Poetry as a Vehicle of Grief, people often say, instead of crying, make do with a long song, 长歌当哭. But he also said, people don't say, instead of laughing, make do with a long song, 长歌当笑. Nobody says 长歌当笑, but 长歌当哭 is a popular saying. When people are sad, they sing, they write poetry, they write stories. So that's one reason to understand the outpouring of mournful stories about Dr. Li. Another reason was the availability of social media platforms. Every age has its internet. The forbidden books before the French Revolution were the internet of that age. Wall posters and regard press were the internet of their age during the Cultural Revolution. Poetry was the internet in the April 5th movement of 1976. But social media are a different kind of internet. They make it possible for collective storytelling on a grand scale. And more importantly, social media storytelling is the closest to the oral tradition of storytelling, praised by scholars like Walter Benjamin. Popular forms of all varieties are used for storytelling on social media. Jokes, humor, as Chris wrote about, chats, live streaming, videos, poetry, cell phone photos, etc. All popular oral forms are close to oral forms. Walter Benjamin was the one who proclaimed the death of the art of storytelling in his 1936 article, The Storyteller. He lamented, quote, "Every morning brings us the news of the globe, and yet we are poor in noteworthy stories." Poor in stories because news did not convey people's experiences. Just bits of fleeting information, Benjamin claimed. For Benjamin, the ideal storyteller tells stories orally to attentive listeners. Moved by what they hear, the listeners become storytellers themselves as they recount the stories to others. In this way, human experiences are passed on from mouth to mouth, from town to town, from generation to generation. Some analysts have blamed social media for our contemporary crisis of narration, arguing that social media propagate mere information at best, and more often just fake news and disinformation. They worry that no truly meaningful stories are told on social media. I think there is truth to these claims, and we all know there's just so much fake news and disinformation. But as we see from the stories about Dr. Li, there are also very meaningful stories on social media. And these stories are possible only because of the availability of social media at the present, despite the way that they have been increasingly controlled. We'll need to recognize that despite their deservedly bad reputation, social media may still be appropriated for meaningful storytelling. So I need to answer, or try to answer, at least to talk about the question I raised in the title of my talk. Is there a crisis of narration? I think there are several possible answers. One answer would be no, there's no crisis, there's no such crisis, but instead, there are lots of new opportunities of storytelling with social media. This is typically what business or political consultants tell their clients. This is also what social media platforms tell their users, right? Share your moments, share your story, share your life, connect with the world, find new things anywhere, anytime. That's Weibo. So for these groups of people, there's no crisis of narration. There's only new opportunities. In response to the first answer, critics, like the philosopher Bing-Chul Han, will say, yes, there is a serious crisis of narration. Because in these instrumentalized forms of storytelling, storytelling has been turned into story selling. The attention economy of the digital age is a story economy, where what matters is not stories of human experiences, but viral memes and sensational titles, clickbait titles that can attract a user's attention. So that's another response. Third possible response is some scholars have argued that the digital age has not necessarily thrown us into a crisis of narration. We just need to revise our understanding of what a narrative is. A narrative, in the classical understanding, is always a complete story with a beginning and middle and end. But on social media, it's just random, short, brief posts right here and there. And often no clear ending, no development of the plot. But they together, if you read them carefully, if you're an attentive reader, you may still piece together a narrative, some kind of even some kind of coherent plot. So they call this new kind of narratives, not the same as the conventional narrative forms. So they are called small narratives, or liminal narratives, or minor narratives, different micro narratives, different names, fragmented narratives. So I think all these three responses have their points to a certain extent. But I would like to offer another response. When we talk about a crisis of narration, we need to ask, a crisis for whom? Is there a crisis of narration for politicians or big corporations? Not quite. They have always dominated the spaces for storytelling. Is there a crisis of narration for ordinary people, for marginalized and disempowered people? Yes. But then, ordinary people have always lived in crises of narration. They always have difficulty telling their stories, past or present. It did not start with Walter Benjamin or with social media. And yet, they have never stopped trying to tell their stories. They have developed vernacular histories and traditions of storytelling. These are their sources of narrative imagination. When they face challenges, they seek inspiration from these traditions while taking advantage of affordances of new media technologies. If in today's world they are telling stories on social media, it's only because that's the media of the time. They make use of whatever media are available in their times. And when media are not available, they create their own media, sometimes using their bodies, right? What matters most is their narrative imagination. Finally, the stories about Dr. Li Wenliang I shared above, I think highlight several aspects of Chinese internet users' narrative imagination. First, Chinese internet users seem to have an irrepressible passion for storytelling. The stories express strong emotions and are told in strong emotional language and aesthetic styles. The main emotions in the stories about Dr. Li were sympathy, sadness, and anger. They're often combined together. Second, Chinese internet users demonstrate remarkable creativity and versatility in the use of storytelling techniques and popular symbolic forms, especially in combining time-tested narrative forms with contemporary digital forms. I think the use of the biography form from the Records of the Grand Historian is a great example of this kind of ability to use popular, symbolic forms to tell stories, ancient forms. Third, the Li Wenliang stories suggest that on social media, the power of narrative imagination and the soul of storytelling lies in the vivid and memorable short forms, the emotionally moving anecdotes, the dramatic scenes. There are a lot of dramatic scenes of stories during the Wuhan lockdown, the funny and humorous jokes and fragments of experiences. They are powerful because they are emotionally moving, because they are easy to recount and remember, and because they are user-friendly, at least to those who use social media. To those who worry that social media discourse is just too brief and fragmented to have any narrative quality, the answer may be that perhaps fragments and fleeting moments are not the problem. The problem may be contemporary conditions of people's lives, which are themselves often fragmented, suspended, even broken and torn apart. Under these conditions, how else can people tell their stories, if not with fragments and anecdotes and broken pieces of discourses, scraps of data and information? What we as readers, observers, and researchers can do is to try to find and recall these anecdotal and fragmented stories, see and hear them, make sense of them, and whenever we have a chance, tell them to more people. Thank you.